everyone. Happy Wednesday. I hope you're staying cool out there on this, second or third wave of really hot heat in the summer. Summer's doing crazy things, but what are you going to do? Well, I have to be honest with you. My focus in the last, closing weeks of my ministry here has really not been classes. And while this has been a good class, both for me and hopefully for you, tonight, for a multitude of reasons, and I'm not trying to excuse myself, I'm saying have been irresponsible when it comes to class. If I were to teach tonight, it would have been a haphazardly and very ill-conceived, really thrown together, ill-prepared mess of stuff tonight, just because my focus has been with people and with other things. And so I apologize about that. I'm not trying to excuse myself. That's just what it is. So instead of trying to do that tonight, which isn't fair to you, wanting good quality teaching and content, I figured actually I would just go to the source of actually where I've been getting a lot of this material. And it's from Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, and they're going to teach tonight about the topic of boundaries. I've included 2 sessions out of, I think, 3 that I was able to find online, and you can get it right from the source. And so this is going to be streamed for the next little over an hour, and so if you don't have the hour, want to come back to it, it'll be up for a little while. But this is actually teaching about boundaries, the same material I was going to teach tonight, just actually from the people who I'm getting it from. And so honestly, it's probably better. I apologize. We'll be back next week, and I hope you have a good Wednesday evening. Enjoy this class about boundaries.
Boundaries are a property line. Their purpose is to define what we are responsible for and what we are not responsible for. Healthy boundaries allow us to live our lives as God intended, free to make choices and to become all we were created to be. The needs and demands of others can get in the way, and it isn't easy to determine the most loving way to handle this. As we have seen, our lives don't work better when we try harder, act nicer, or take responsibility for others. The functions of a boundary are to keep the good in and the bad out, to act as an alarm system, and to help us protect our freedom. Join Dr. Cloud as he takes you into a deeper understanding of healthy boundaries.
Hey guys, welcome to session 1 of Boundaries. What we're going to be doing in this session is we're going to be talking about kind of an overview of what a boundary is, what it looks like, what it does. And let me start out with one of my favorite boundary stories. If you've ever heard me talk about this, you've probably heard me tell this story because I think everyone can identify with somebody in the room that day. Here's what happened. I was at the hospital. A family came by and wanted to see me, and I sat down, and it was a mom and a dad and 2 adult kids of theirs in their roughly mid-20s. So the dad says to me, "I want you to fix my son." Now, if you're a psychologist, a sentence starts out like that, you got a problem, right? But I turned to the young man and I said, "So what's your problem?" He says to me, "Well, it's not me. He's talking about my brother." And I said, "Well, where's your brother?" And the father pipes in at that point and he says, "Well, he didn't want to come today." And I said, "Well, why didn't he want to come?" He said, "Well, he doesn't think he has any problems." I said, "Well, perhaps he doesn't. I mean, if he didn't want to," and the father goes, "Oh, yes, he does. He has a lot of problems." And I said, "Well, like what?" And he said, "Well, we know that he's got a drug problem." I said, "Well, that can be serious. What kind of drugs?" And he said, "He's been smoking dope since he was about 15. I said, "How old is he now?" He said, "He's 23. I go, "Okay," I did the math. I said, "Well, he's mellow by now. Well, what else is going on?" He said, "Well, he's flunked out of 3 colleges. Now, my first thought was, how do you do that? I mean, how do you flunk out of 3 colleges? I know how to flunk out of 1, but how do you get in the second one? So I asked him, "How do you do that?" And he said, "Well, he didn't even have the grades to get in the first one. I got him in because I'm on the board of the college, and then he flunked out of that one, and I knew some people. I got him in the second one, and so now I'm starting to understand this, right?" I said, "Okay, so he flunks out of 4. And then the father goes, "And doctor, we've tried everything." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he flunked out of the first one because all the partying that happens in the dorms. So I put him in the second one. I bought him a nice condo off campus. I didn't want to work to interfere because he had a lot of studying, so I made sure he had plenty of money. Flunks out again." I said, "Imagine that, kids. Think about it." So he goes on, and then at this juncture, you really see a little window into the pain of the dad. I said, "Any other problems?" And he says, "Well, let me tell you what bothers me the most." He said, "When I was his age, I had started 3 companies. He doesn't even have a college major. I looked at him and I said, where's he today? The father said, well, he didn't want to come. I said, I know he didn't want to come, but where might I find him? And the father says, well, he's in Vail. I said, Colorado? He said, yeah. I said, what's he doing in Colorado? He said, he's skiing. I thought for a minute. I looked at the dad and I said, you know what? I'm very sorry. I don't think I can help your son. He said, why not? And I said, well, I'm a psychologist and I help people with problems. And frankly, I agree with him. He doesn't have any. Father looks at me, sort of like my German Shepherd does when she doesn't get it, you know. He said, what do you mean doesn't have any problems? I said, sir, the man is in Vail skiing. Does that sound like somebody with problems to you? He's got pretty much everybody, you know, he's got plenty of money. He's got a new house. He's got free time. He's off on a vacation. I can't help him because he doesn't have any problems. I said, on the other hand, I can help you because you got a lot of problems. He said, what are you talking about? I said, you got a flunk out of school problem, a dope problem. He goes, that's not me. That's my son. I said, whoa, your son doesn't have any of those problems. He's in Vail skiing. You are in a psychiatric hospital. You know what kind of people come to psychiatric hospitals? People with problems. Ergo, you must have some problems. He said, but that's not... I said, you own these problems. You possess these problems. These are your problems, whether you like it or not. He doesn't have any of these problems, but I'm going to help you because I can't help him. Remember, I can't help him. Why not? Because he doesn't have any problems. Let me tell you, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you to help him to have some problems. Looked at me like, say that again? I can't help him because he doesn't have any problems. But I can help you because you got lots of problems. But here's how I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you to help him to have some problems. I'm going to teach you a concept called boundaries. Now, as I went on to explain to him a number of things which we'll unpack here, this is kind of the overview of what a boundary is so we can get clear from the beginning. Okay, when you think about a definition of a boundary, basically a boundary is pure and simple a property line, okay? If you think about your property, what do you got? You live here on this lot or in this apartment or in this house and you got the lot and there's a property line around it. And then what happens? You've got a neighbor who lives next door to you, okay? And that's their property. So what is the first thing that the property line, the boundary, do? It defines where one person's property begins and ends, and the other one begins and ends. So this is where I end, and this is where you begin, right? Now, if I drew it a little better, you wouldn't even have a gap in there. It's sort of like, next door to each other. So here's the deal. Boundaries, pure and simple, the definition is a property line. That's what it is. So what do? They define ownership, right? Defines ownership. This is me. This is not me. This is me. This is you. This is the dad. This is the son. All right? So if we know ownership of something, if you own something, what do you have? You have control. Okay? You control what goes on your property. The Bible calls that self-control, Galatians 5. It's a fruit of the Spirit, that we were designed to have self-control. But if we have control, what else comes along with that? We are responsible for what goes on our property, and we're not responsible for what goes on in somebody else's property. All right, now watch this. If this is me and this is you, I am my problem. You are your problem, okay? And as we'll see in a later session, we do have a responsibility to each other, but what we're talking about now is what I'm responsible for. So here's what I had said to the dad. I said, you know what's happening? These lines are all crossed. You don't have any boundaries. See, the son is not taking ownership of his life. He's not taking control of his life. He's out of control with his behavior, and he's not taking responsibility for his life. And the problem is that when you have all of these things going on, there's another thing that happens. and that is that there are consequences to all of this, right? There's consequences. So here's what, and that's what boundaries do. They define where the consequences, where the control, where the responsibility is. So what happens here is now, see, the son is out of control in his behavior. And what's happening is, like, think of it in a yard. Let's say he had a tree growing here that he wasn't pruning, and then the limbs started reaching over here, and then lightning came and he hadn't pruned these and they're sticking over your yard. Lightning comes and it falls into this yard. What do? Well, you call the attorney. And what does the law do? It defines who's responsible for what. And so what the judge would say, he'd go, dude, that was your tree falling over in this yard. You're the one that should pay for that. Okay, now translated, you're not studying. That should be your problem. You should be paying for that. But what happens was the consequences were all falling in the yard of the dad. Now, this could be a number of scenarios. What if somebody is in a marriage or in a relationship or in a family is using drugs or is abusive or has a rage problem or this, that, and the other? Well, whenever somebody isn't taking responsibility for their lives, there are collateral damages that fall into the hearts, minds, and souls of the people who love them. And so what happens is, if the people who love them have no boundaries, they keep ending up with all the pain of this person's problems. And that is not right. Now, here's the deal. That doesn't mean that we don't carry each other's pain. That's a different thing. We'll come to that in a minute. What we're talking about here is not like if somebody over here is hurting and we're going to bear their burden, that's very different. If somebody's, they've gone through an illness or they've had bad things happen to them, this, that, and the other, what do? We go over to their house and we take care of them. That's bearing one another's burdens. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about in this beginning part of boundaries is when somebody over here is not taking responsibility for their life and the collateral damage is falling in somebody else's yard. Now, what boundaries do is they begin to set a limit of saying, wait a minute, whose problem is this? This is your tree. This is your drug problem. This is your no study problem. I, the dad, I should be in Vail skiing today, and you should be studying or suffering the consequences or earning the money that I'm giving you or whatever it is. You should be responsible, so I'm not paying for this. Said another way, if somebody's got a drug problem and we have good boundaries, we say to them, that is in your yard. You're not going to bring that into this house. You're not going to, if you're abusive, you're not going to bring the abuse into this house. And there's going to be a limit. So the consequences of the problem fall over here, okay? Now, that's basically what boundaries are. And throughout the scriptures, you see two lines of God's character that are always parallel: his love and his care and his righteousness and the limits and all of the different aspects of his law that define how we're supposed to live and responsibility. And those always go together: grace and truth, righteousness and mercy. And see, when God loves, he also holds people responsible. God never loves without holding people responsible, then he would be codependent, right? And God never holds people responsible without being loving, because then he would be a tyrant and a judge and just condemn everybody to hell because we've all screwed up. What he does is he brings both of them. He has forgiveness and he confronts our sin, and he wants us to do better. The law was given through Moses, remember that? But grace and truth were realized through Jesus. So what we're talking about here is not nuking the son, just giving him the truth. And we're talking about not just loving him and letting him get away with anything. We're talking about being a person of grace and truth, where the Father loves the Son and he says, I love you, and here are the requirements. And that's what you see in healthy relationships. You see love and you see requirements. And when we don't live up to the requirements, we speak the truth in love and set limits and boundaries, require each other to be responsible. Now, what's the Bible's word for when we're not doing that? When we step over in somebody else's yard? Look at this. Isn't this cool? We start talking about a property line. What does the Bible call it from day one? Trespassing. Trespassing is when I step over the boundary, go over the fence. That's when you're a trespasser. You go over the fence, you break the boundary, and somebody ends up hurt. And so that is the problem of the universe. All right, let me tell you a few other things that boundaries do for us. Boundaries, as I said, define responsibility and control and property line and all of that. And they talk about where me and not me is, where I end and you begin. And then the next thing is it tells me what I'm responsible for and who I'm responsible to. See, this is me. If this is me, I'm responsible for me and I'm responsible to you. So if you're doing something to me, I also have a responsibility to take responsibility for my feelings and say, you know what, that's hurting me. I've got to be proactive, and we'll see these come up later in the laws of boundaries in that session. I got to be proactive, take responsibility for the hurt, okay, stewardship over the hurt, and go to you and tell you about it and work out that conflict. I'm not responsible for your behavior. I'm responsible to you to reconcile the relationship. And that's how this works. See, the father isn't responsible for the studying, but he is responsible to the son to set limits and consequences so that the kid can get his act together. That's why when a family has to do an intervention, for example, on a drug addict or an alcoholic or somebody like that, they are being responsible to them by holding the boundaries. Leviticus 19 says this, do not pervert justice. It said, now watch this. It says, do not show partiality to the poor or needy or favoritism to the great and powerful. When do we lose our boundaries? When somebody over here is not being responsible, but the poor little person, you know, they've had it so hard, and you know it's so hard for them to show up and get up and go to work because they, you know, they're having a bad day, and what do? It's always somebody that, you know, when we are like not getting our act together, certainly we got problems and we feel sorry for people and we don't hold them to the limit, right? But you know what part of getting well is? It's being held to the limit. When I used to work in a lot of psychiatric hospitals and you have somebody check in that's very, very depressed, do we feel for them? Are they in need? Absolutely, they're in need. And we love and feel compassion for them. But if they're going to get well, you got to go and make them show up to group. You got to make them do the hard work of therapy. You got to make them talk about stuff. You got to make them learn new skills. So when God says don't pervert justice, don't be partial to the needy, just because somebody's broken doesn't mean there's not requirements even when we are broken. If you go in and get surgery at the hospital, you're going to wake up the next day, oh boy, are you needy? Are you in pain? And guess what? Nurse Ratched walks in and knocks on your door and says, okay, you got to get moving. Ah, it hurts. I know it hurts, but you got to move those muscles. See, even when somebody is broken, there are requirements. If your kid's struggling in school, they got to show up and do the homework. We love and have compassion, yes. But there are always requirements. There are always requirements. That's why the Bible says if any man doesn't work, don't let him eat. Are we going to help? Absolutely going to help. But there's going to be requirements. Okay? There's no free lunch. Even for babies. I mean, think about this. From the day you're born, you got to show up and do something to get the food. What do you got to do? You got to pick up the phone. You got to do something. You got to call mom to come in there, you know, and bring the milk, right? And it never ends. Sorry, guys, no free lunch. There's always requirements, and that's what boundaries do. They tell us who's responsible for what. Okay? So the other thing that boundaries do is that boundaries keep, let me draw this again. Boundaries keep the good stuff in and the bad stuff out. Okay? Think about your house. What do your fences do? Why do you have a gate and a lock? Well, you got a bunch of stuff in your house. It's good stuff. You got a fridge, you got a TV, you got a dog, you got some people you love, you got some jewelry, whatever. You lock the door at night to keep the good stuff in and the burglars out. Right? So the Bible says, guard your heart with all diligence. So what does that mean? It means that you got to guard your heart with all diligence. That's what Proverbs tells us. So if somebody's going to do something hurtful, what do? You say, no, no, I don't want that. That's not good. That hurts me. Keep that bad stuff out of here, right? Psalm 101. Go read Psalm 101. David lists a bunch of stuff. Liars and unfaithful people and judgmental people and all this stuff. He goes, get away from me. I don't want it in my house. And then he says something else. He says that the faithful, the good people, they are the ones that will minister to me. So he's going to let them in so good stuff can come in, but he's going to keep the bad stuff out. And we make choices in relationship to keep abusive people away and let good people in. The Bible is very, very clear about that. Okay, so here's the deal. What are we learning? Boundaries keep the good things in and the bad things out, but boundaries are not walls. See, boundaries are also permeable. So I've got a gate that I can swing open and I can let love in. Okay? But if abuse shows up and comes knocking, what do? I close it. Okay? And throughout the scriptures, go to Matthew 18. If somebody does something hurtful, you go to them and it says you confront it in love and you say, this was hurtful. And it says if they're wise, they go, gosh, my problem, sorry, won't do that again. And then you go, fine. And it says you've won them over. But what if you say you have hurt me and they don't care and they're not listening? Do you say, oh, well, I'm patient and forgiving? No, it says increase the boundary. It says get 2 or 3 others and go to them and put a stronger boundary up against abuse. And then if they don't listen to it, it says to 2 or 3, get a stronger group. And finally, what it says is wall yourself off from them. Look at Matthew 18, starting in verse 15 up to about 21 or 2 or so. It says, finally, if they won't listen, then separate. Okay? You know what the next verse in the passage is? It says this, and you've heard this verse misused in so many ways, but here's what it says. For whatever you bind, hear that? Put a boundary around. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in the heavens. And whatever you loose will be loosed. So in your life, you're going to make sure that there are boundaries binding evil so it cannot destroy. And instead, we can be a force to transform evil. And that is basically what boundaries do. So keeps the good in and the bad out, defines responsibility, control, all this great stuff. And then what you've got is you got to remember that this came from somewhere. Where did boundaries come from? Well, it comes from God. God, think about this, God is separate from his creation. There are boundaries where he begins and ends, and the creation begins and ends. That God is a subject and an object, right? And he is not his creation. We're not pantheists, like God is everything, and God and I am God, and you are God, and we are all together, and we sit in a hot tub and strum a guitar. That's not our faith. Our faith is firmly rooted in reality that there's a God that is separate and in relationship to you and me, but he is not us. The New Age philosophy says that we are God and all is one. No, the Christian faith says there are real limits and boundaries of identity, and I am separate from you, and you are separate from me, and we are separate from God. And even within God, there are separate identities and boundaries of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, who are connected in one, but they're also separate. And from there flows everything. Okay? So, a couple more things about this. Let me give you some examples of boundaries. What is it that shows, because in the physical world, it's easy to see a fence, right? But if you walked around your relationships and held up a big fence, people think you're weird, so don't do that. But they still have to see your boundaries. So how are they going to see your boundaries? Well, the first boundary that shows what's you and not you is your skin. So if somebody violates our body in some way, that's a boundary violation. And we are pretty much responsible for everything that happens, with our skin on. So if you do something with your body, you're the one in control of that unless you're violated. And wherever we show up, there we are, and we're the ones that drove. So we've got to be responsible. The Bible says to possess this vessel in honor. So we've got to be responsible for our own bodies. Number 2, your words. When somebody steps over here and does something injurious, you should have a word that they run into and you say, no, don't do that, or I don't like that, or that's wrong, or that's hurtful. So how do we know when we stepped over the boundaries? We've got to learn to be assertive, and we've got to learn to speak the truth, what? In love. Okay? Boundaries are not about beating people up. Boundaries are about lovingly saying, oops, sorry, trespass, violation. No, I don't want to do that. So let them see your words. The next one, the truth. We live our lives according to God's truth. He gives us the boundaries of what we should be saying yes to and what we should be saying no to. And when somebody violates that boundary, then that's where we talk about the truth and say, you know what, I really believe in certain values like honesty. The Bible says that we need honesty in our relationships, and what you just did, it wasn't honest. And so I've got to talk about when these truths that are really important to me are violated, then there's going to be we got to have a discussion. So the truth, and when God tells us certain truths, like if you're single and dating, He tells you the truth that you have to take responsibility for how you act in a dating relationship, and that's violated, or somebody wants you to violate that in some way, where you can say, you know what, I live according to these values, and these are important to me. And I like to really, I like to go out with people that aren't taking drugs. Or I like to go out with people that maybe are going somewhere in life and don't spend, all day on the couch, video games, texting mom to bring them a sandwich. That's really not the way that I want to live. So there are truths that you communicate. All right. So then what's another one? Sometimes you need the boundary of a geographical distance. I said Matthew 18 said sometimes that you separate from people. The Bible talks about this in a lot of ways. It says that the prudent people, Proverbs says, prudent people see danger and hide themselves. Sometimes you might have to get away from somebody. There are people that have restraining orders ultimately for boundaries, or go to a shelter, or get away from a toxic situation. Go stay at a friend's house or something. Geographical distance. Emotional distance. Sometimes you stay in physical proximity, but there's emotional distance. Emotional distancing, and you say, you know what, I love you, I'm with you, I want to work this out. There's certain parts of my heart that I can't trust you with yet, so I'm going to hold that until the behavior is trustworthy, but I'm in here with you, okay? So sometimes we don't trust everything that somebody says until there's behavior and there's a track record to do that. And then other people are a boundary sometimes. Remember in Matthew 18 where it says you go confront somebody, but then if they don't listen, you bring 2 or 3 others. Sometimes you need to have the safety of your support system to deal with a very difficult boundary situation. Okay, so lastly, what falls within my property that I'm responsible for? Remember I said that this is the 4, this is me. I'm responsible for this, and I'm responsible to you. Okay? What am I responsible for? Let me give you a list. My feelings, my attitudes, my behaviors, my choices, my values, my limits, my talents, my thoughts, my desires, and my love. All of those aspects of personhood are my responsibility. So in our relationship, let's say something's going on and I'm having feelings like, I'm being hurt or you're bugging me or something. Those are my responsibility. I can't blame you for that and resent you. What I got to do is take responsibility for how I feel and go talk to you about it. If I got attitudes that are ruining my life, then I got to take ownership of that and work with my attitudes. If I got behaviors, if I'm making choices, if I'm not setting the right limits, those are all my problem. And you know what? Ultimately, it's kind of the story of the Bible that our life is our problem. Problem's not a bad thing. Problems are basically means opportunities that we got stuff to solve. And God has us born on a day And basically, we got a lot of problems for 80 or however long we live. And what that means is that we have to take ownership of our feelings every day and our attitudes and our behaviors and our values and our limits and our choices and our talents. Remember the parable of the talents? Talk about ownership. God gives this person talents, goes away on a long journey, comes back, holds them responsible for what ownership they took of that talent. That's our life. So basically, you'll see what boundaries, and we're going to talk about, are and what they're not. What boundaries are basically the structure of the way God has designed life, where the boundaries are, where the limits are, where the responsibility is, where the ownership is. Ultimately, a good word for boundaries, stewardship. That we have to be stewards over our life. Guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the issues of life. Okay? That's what boundaries are. Boundaries aren't being mean. Boundaries don't mean that we don't love. But what boundaries do is, like the law of God, structures love. That's what we're talking about here. That God has set up his law, his boundaries, his structure of how love works. And if love works, people have different roles and responsibilities in their relationship. And that's what boundaries are talking about. Now, again, boundaries are not all about just setting limits on what we're going to take responsibility for and what we're not. As we'll see in a later session, boundaries also mean that we take control of ourselves and we extend ourselves to bear one another's burdens, for example. But here's just another example of this. In Galatians 6, where it says, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. What it says right after that is, for each one shall carry their own load. You know the difference in a burden and a load? A burden is something that's excessively weighty, that there's no way that they, even as responsible as they can be, there's no way they can bear that burden. And love says that we take control of our own lives and we extend ourselves to help somebody. Somebody goes through an illness, somebody goes through a divorce, somebody goes through a bankruptcy, somebody is struggling, somebody's broken, somebody's needy. We help them carry that burden. But then right in the same passage, it says, but each person has to carry their own load. And so even somebody that we're helping, there's a requirement for them to do whatever they can do in that situation as well. Like I said, somebody's depressed, they got to go to therapy, they got to talk about it, even though we're helping, okay? There's always boundaries of responsibility, okay? We're going to have a fun time in all these sessions. This is just session 1. We got a lot to do, and hope you enjoy the series. Now, I've got some questions for you. Number 1 is, as you define boundaries in the way that we define it here, then can you see any areas where you have had boundary crossings? Okay. Number 2, where did you learn that you were responsible for other people? Or where did you learn that it wasn't okay to have limits and say no? And number 3, who is going to be, because we're going to see, you're going to have some people to help you here. Who's going to be your support system to help build your boundaries as you go forward? Hopefully it's the group you're in now. If you're watching this as an individual, find a buddy, find a good prayer partner, find somebody to support you. Okay? That's it for this time, and I will see you when I come back. John, I think, will be doing session number 2. Okay, bye-bye.
Session 2 will provide guidelines to evaluate the results of a lack of boundaries in your life. This lack produces a variety of bad fruit. This fruit shows up in 3 main areas of life: clinical, relational, and functional. Clinical symptoms include depression, resentment, rage or anger, and obsessive and compulsive behaviors. Relational symptoms include a sense of a loss of freedom, loss of love, and sometimes financial difficulties. Functional symptoms include the inability to complete a goal or task, extreme disorganization, a low energy level, and problems of concentration. Join Dr. Townsend as he helps you evaluate these 3 areas of life and see what the fruit has been in your life.
Hi, everybody. I'm John Townsend, and welcome to the Boundaries DVD series. Henry and I are really glad to be doing this. Kind of a fresh look at it after all this time that the Boundaries material's been out there, and there's been a lot of interest in us bringing something to you that had the new research we've been able to look at, and the new stories from people, and the new learnings, and this sort of thing. So we're just excited to be revisiting a topic that seems like it won't go away. You know, we thought all those years ago when we wrote Boundaries that, okay, that's a topic, we'll do other things. And we've done a lot of other things since then, but people still have a lot of interest in what boundaries are about and how to have them. And also, like, how do they fit in my current relationships today? So I hope this is helpful to you. Now, this session is going to be what's called the fruits, or not the fruits, but the symptoms of boundary problems. And I always like to come back to one of my favorite passages in the Bible when we talk about the symptoms. And it's in Matthew chapter 7. And Jesus is talking about trees. And he says, a good tree brings good fruit. And he says, a bad tree brings bad fruit. And he goes on to talk about how you can tell someone by their fruit, someone's life by their fruit. Specifically, he was talking about religious leaders of the day. But the point he was making is one that really makes a big difference in how your boundaries exist, in that you can tell you have a boundary problem by the fruit in your life, by the good fruit in your life that occurs from having good, clear, honest, loving boundaries, and the bad fruit that happens in your life if you don't have boundaries, or you don't have consistent boundaries, or you're not clear about them, or you're not keeping them up or keeping them firm. I'll give you an example of this. I was working in a corporate setting, and one of the executive vice presidents was talking about the people that report to him, his direct reports, and we're just kind of going over how they were performing and how they were relating. And we got to Sam and Susie and Billy, and he finally says, I got a problem with one of these. I said, what's up with it? He says, well, you got to help me with my anger problem with Scott. And I said, anger problem with Scott? He said, yeah, I've got an anger problem. I said, no, you don't. You're kind of a normal guy. You don't have anger issues, not more than other people do. He goes, yeah, you got to help me with the anger problem. Like, should I start walking around the building or taking breaks, or should I start, meditating or counting to 10 or taking deep breaths, or help me with my anger problem? And I said, I just don't get it. Tell me what's going on. He said, well, Scott's my marketing guy. And very, very talented person, very creative, lots of great ideas. But he doesn't take orders well. He resents it. Feels like anytime I'm checking on things, I'm micromanaging. And I said, no, you're not a micromanager. He said, well, he thinks I am. And not really a team player, sort of gets in the way and kind of got to be his way or no way. And he said, you got to help me with my anger problem. And I said, if you have an anger problem, then you must have a contaminatory disease, because now I have an anger problem too. I'm mad at Scott too. So you just gave me the disease. And he says, well, what am I going to do? I said, well, I don't think you have an anger problem. I said, you have a Scott problem. And you could start to see the lights kind of coming on a bit. And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you get along with your other 7 directs just fine. They're normal people, and you like working with each other, and you get things done, and you perform well. I said, but it's always about him and his, basically what I would call his character issues. His resistance to being on a team, his resistance to doing things in cooperative fashion, his resistance to taking orders from you. Those are all character issues. And I said, I think that your anger is a sign that you need to pay attention to the Scott problem. Let's fix the Scott problem and see what happens to your anger problem. And he said, that's kind of shrink talk. And I said, well, just, hear me out, right? That's why I'm here. So we worked with Scott, and unfortunately, Scott wasn't the kind of person that would take orders from anyone. And even, nice, friendly orders, he just felt like anybody telling him what to do was kind of offensive to him. He had what we would call authority issues in the psychology world. So Scott ended up moving on to another place, and it was better for everybody. But I'll never forget that illustration, because what my client thought was the problem was not the problem. Scott, his relationship with Scott and Scott's kind of buggy character issues that got in the way of good work were the problem. But the symptom, the fruit of my client was that he was mad, he was angry. And he was confused, thinking, I've got to solve that problem. You never have to. You never should look at it like that, because if you do that, you'll never solve the real issue. You know, there are three major categories that Henry and I talk about in boundaries that we're going to go into that are not the problem but the fruit itself. And then when you understand the fruit, you can say, okay, now what's the issue underneath it? It would be a little bit like going in your car down the road and the warning light comes on, the oil light comes on, and it's red and it bugs you and you're trying to listen to some great music, and this little beepy, annoying red light comes on, and you take a hammer and you bust it out and say, well, okay, I've solved my problem. I don't have this annoying problem anymore. Well, what's going to happen? Well, your car's going to seize up a few miles down the road, because all you did was you took care of the fruit. You didn't take care of the problem itself, which was, too much oil or not enough oil. There's never too much oil, I guess. Burning oil or leaking oil, right? So I want to talk about the three categories so you can have the tools and skills to identify when I'm feeling something or experiencing something in a relationship. That's not the problem. Maybe I haven't been clear about some boundaries that I need to set. I have never set or haven't been consistent in setting. So we're going to be talking about the problem, the real problem, and the symptom, or the trees and the fruits. Well, the first category is what we call the clinical symptoms. Now, by clinical symptoms, that's a kind of a professional word, a little technical, but just meaning, clinical means that there is a problem in personal functions. When you have a clinical problem, it's a problem in your personal functions. For example, one of the areas of the clinical world is your emotional life, your emotions, your feelings. If you're sad because you see a sad movie and you come home and then you play with the kids and feed your dog and everything, well, that's not a clinical grief issue. But if you're sad and you can't get out of bed in the morning and you have no energy and you feel like there's this weight on you that you can't get rid of and you're in mud, well, that's depression. And that crosses what they call the clinical line. And the clinical line means this isn't just normal emotions. There's a line of severity that you've crossed. If you've got to go get help, you've got to go get a psychologist, or you've got to get in counseling or medication or something like that. You've crossed that clinical line from just normal emotions to, these are really taking over my life. One of those, and I'm going to give you some of the emotions that come when you don't set good boundaries, or you didn't know you have boundaries, or someone crosses your boundaries, or things that happen. One of the emotions is anger. Anger. Guess what? People have anger. Even nice people have angry. Have angry. Nice people even don't speak well. Like I don't speak well. Anger. Now, what's anger a sign of? Well, anger is basically a sign that there's a problem you can't solve that you need to address, and you're feeling more energy, and you're feeling agitated, and you're feeling frustrated, and you want to go beat something up sometimes. But anger basically means there's a problem to be solved. Many, many times, anger, not all the time, but many, many times, anger is a sign that you haven't set the correct boundaries. It'd be sort of like in the basement of your home, if you've got it all wired up so you've got alarms in the home. California, we don't have basements because we have earthquakes, but most of the world has basements. And if a burglar tries to break into your basement, that alarm's going to go off, and there's going to be a bell or a sound or whatever. Well, look at anger is that little alarm that says, "Hey, somebody just broke into your basement." They tried to take your time, or they tried to steal your money, or they tried to take advantage of you, and you go, "That bothers me." Well, that's the case with my client. His anger was his little emotional signal, clinical sign. He didn't have clinical anger, but he had it. He had some anger that something's wrong. Here's another one. Anxiety. Sometimes when we're in a tough boundary situation and someone is intimidating us and we can't say no to them, for example, in a marriage, a lot of times if one person is more dominant and more scary and more powerful, and the other person is sort of like, I don't have these skills and I'm not a mean person, I can't fight with you, they'll feel terribly anxious. And their anxiety is a sign that somebody's trying to control me. They're trying to take freedom away from me. So your anxiety is telling you, that's another alarm saying, you've got a problem here. Another one is sadness. And what does sadness mean? Sadness just means I've lost something. I've had to let something go. Some people feel tremendous sadness when they look over their business and they think, I didn't, set limits when I should have. Look what happened. And I'm not as productive as I wanted to be. Or my marriage, for so many years, I never said no, and I feel this sadness. I was talking to a couple the other day who they've got really good boundaries now, but they didn't have them until they were been married maybe 25 years, a long time, and they finally got them, and they read boundaries in marriage, and it helped them a lot, and they love each other a lot more now. But they literally had to go through some grief where they had to sit down and think all those years of, gosh, not knowing you could say no and not respecting each other's freedom, and some person in charge of the other person had to go through some sadness. So look at your feeling states and say, maybe that's a reason that I have these emotions. Here's another one. Not only your thoughts in the clinical world, not only emotions, but your thoughts. The way you think about things, not just the way you feel about things, because there are certain thought patterns you'll have that are a sign that there's a boundary problem. For example, thoughts of defeat. I'll never change. This relationship will never happen. I feel helpless, and there's nothing I can do. These are defeated thoughts. Well, a lot of times they've happened because you're in a relationship where you've begged and you've pleaded and you've shown reason and you've shown Bible verses and you said, I'll do anything, and the person says, I don't want to change. I like running you and me and being irresponsible, and you feel not only feel defeated, but you have these defeated thoughts like it'll never change. Here's another one. I have what they call in the cognitive psychology world, learned helplessness. Learned helplessness, where I think there's 2 S's and 2 S's. Well, you English majors, let me know about that. Learned helplessness means there's nothing I can do. I don't have any choices here. And it's a horrible thought to have, but many times people have these sorts of thoughts when they've never had boundaries in their life. And what will happen here is, after a lot of times of trying to change a person or change a relationship and not having the skills, not knowing what you can and can't do, you'll just kind of go, this is just the way my life is, and I don't have choices. Yeah, the Bible says we've got choices all over the place. The Bible says choose this day who you're going to serve, and the Bible says that you're supposed to grow in wisdom. And you always have choices in a relationship, but a lot of times learned helplessness says you don't. And then the behavioral symptoms. You got the emotions, you got the thoughts, you got the behavior. And what are some behaviors? Well, things like bad habits, or things like addictions. Bad habits and addictions. Bad habits like maybe I'm eating too much and I'm not working out and I'm feeling sluggy. Well, you know what? A lot of people have a bad habit like that because they feel like I can't control anything in my relationship or my work. Everybody's in charge of me or my spouse or my dating life. So I can control the amount that I eat, and food won't say no to me. So they develop a bad habit of eating, or smoking a lot, or drinking a lot, those sorts of things. And then addictions, like the bad stuff, like alcoholism and drug addiction and pornography and sexual problems and all this sort of thing. The stuff that really turns your life into a disaster. A lot of times that comes because a person doesn't feel like they've got any choices. So be aware that some of the things people deal with, anger, anxiety, sadness, defeat, learned helplessness, habits, and addictions, they are the fruit. They're not the tree. All right, so that's the first area. The second area is not just the what we call the clinical world, but also in your outline, it's the relational world. And the relational world is your key connections. The key connections you have in life, the people that matter the most to you, like your spouse if you're married, or the person you're dating and you care about a lot and you're in love with, or your kids, or your parents, or family members, or friends, people that you care about, neighbors, people at work, colleagues, people at church, all those different categories of relationships we have. The key connections. And the way those key connections are going is often a sign that you might have boundary problems too. One thing I've noticed is that of the three we've got here, we've got the clinical symptoms, relational symptoms, and functional symptoms. The relational one is generally the one that comes up first. Most people will call or ask for help or have a question, generally dealing with a relationship problem. It's sort of like, since we're relational beings and God made us relational beings, all the way from Genesis 2, it says that it's not good that we be alone. By the way, that's not a marriage passage, that's a relationship passage. In the Hebrew, it's not about marriage at all. It's just about the fact that we need each other as well as needing God. we kind of live and die by relationships, and we feel good when our relationships are good, and we feel bad when they're not good. So I think this is kind of like the first sign that people have that something's going wrong. Here's some of the things that happen in relationships. Alienation. God created us to be intimate and close and vulnerable and to love each other and be open to each other. And sometimes when there's boundary problems, someone will say, it hurt my feelings that, you're 45 minutes late to everything, and, it's just hard to, plan anything, and I feel kind of dismissed by that. Or someone will say, gosh, I feel like when I tell you about how I'm doing, you kind of make it all about you, and I'd rather have a mutual relationship. Or you're really critical of me, and you beat me up a lot, emotionally speaking. Well, when that happens, the heart connection that we're supposed to have with each other just basically gets cut in half, and we alienate. You pull away because you don't feel like I'm loved. You don't feel like I'm safe. You feel like I don't belong here. And so there's this rift that happens in between people, and there's alienation of love, whether it's your spouse or your friend or your neighbor or your colleague. It's a big problem. So when people overstep our boundaries and don't listen to what we need and don't pay attention to what we're asking for, we'll shut down, and the relationship begins to suffer. Another one is control problems. Control problems. And this is a big issue in marriage, especially when one person is more dominant or powerful than the other. It's great to have power. It's great. I think everybody needs a lot of power in life. Life requires choices and thinking out of the box and doing hard things. But when one person is playing the parent to another person, we'll do it my way. And if you disagree with them about finances, they blow up, or they're kind of in charge of everything. I mean, think about the Hollywood marriages that you read about in the grocery store line, which is where I get most of my research these days. I just get a lot of information from those magazines, and you'll find out that one person, a jealous star husband wouldn't let his star wife fly in the same plane with other people on a movie set because he didn't want them to hit on her or whatever. I mean, it's crazy control stuff. Well, when you find out that one person can't make choices, then you have a boundary problem. So what happens is one person becomes the parent and one person becomes the child, and that's where you get a control problem. So one person's either saying it's going to be my way or the highway, and they blow up and they make you feel guilty when you don't do it their way, or one person's a child and says, I can do whatever I want, and you got to solve my problems. This is like the spendaholic spouse, the spendaholic friend or relatives that says, I just need a little bit more money because, you've got it and I don't. And I'm just going to make messes and mess up my credit, and you've got to fix that. Or I have an addiction, and so you solve my problem. Or I'm going to go spend a lot of money on, on alcohol, and you've got to, fix that. So when the child is saying, solve my problems, that's a control issue. When the parent is saying, you'll do it my way, that's a control problem too. It's horrible. I mean, people really lose love. Responsibility problems, very similar. When people have a problem in ownership, you'll find that that's a symptom of a boundary issue. For example, it says in Luke chapter 9, Jesus said everybody's required to carry their cross. We all have a cross we're supposed to carry, the demands of reality. To be financially, prudent, and to be good in our relationships, to have a good relationship with God, find our mission, heal, grow, and all those sorts of things, take care of our families. And when a person doesn't have ownership, they move into blame. And you've known lots of people that their whole life is blaming other people, and that's a sign of a boundary problem, that they're not taking on their own little knapsack of what they're supposed to carry. So you'll see that in relationships. And then there's what's called judgment issues. And judgment is horrible. If you've ever been in a judgmental relationship where someone is condemning the other person and someone's harshly criticizing, harsh criticism, and the reason I say harsh is because we do need to be criticized. I mean, my core life and my family, they criticize me, and I ask them to. They probably do it in my family whether I ask them to or not, but I'm glad I asked them to because it works. But, we all need to know that people say that there's some course correction to do here. Your attitude's kind of stinky here, or, you're not really paying attention to other people, or you're into yourself or whatever. But harsh criticism, where it's like not loving. So condemnation, harsh criticism. And you'll find that is another symptom or fruit of boundary problems. When someone really kind of feels like they're a judge and jury over you, and they're crossing the boundary of love, and they're crossing the boundary of respect, and they're crossing the boundary of, kind of how to treat people kindly. I mean, when you have this, sometimes you've got to say to the other person, I really want to change and grow and all this, but I kind of lose heart because you're so harsh with me. Let me tell you how you sound to me. I'm working with one executive. I was working with one executive who, nicest person in the world, but he'd come from a family where he'd had a very, very critical father, and father was very successful, and a stable man, had a loving family. But when he came down very hard. And my client, who is now running his own company, adopted that, didn't even know it, and so we'd be having dinner, me and his wife, and he'd say something so mean, and she wouldn't like even flinch, and I'd say, now that would hurt my feelings, Sally, and she goes, really? And then when I said that, her feelings started getting hurt, like she was so used to it that she kind of put it off, and I went, this is not okay, guys. And he would say, but I'm just telling the truth. I'm trying to be honest here. You always tell me to be honest. And I was saying, yeah, you got to be honest, but you got to be loving too. And my point is, he literally didn't even know he was being condemning. We started working with his relationship with his dad in his head, and found out that his dad had been very, very too mean to him, and he sort of thought that was normal. So we got them out of the judgment phase, but he was crossing the boundaries of love and respect with her. So pay attention to those, because if you can look at alienation and say, it's not that we're alienated, it's that I pulled away when you controlled me. It's not that we have control problems. It's that when I'm always the parent kind of sweeping up after you, I just shut down. There's a boundary problem there. It's not just that there's a responsibility problem. It's that I feel like I've got to take charge and own your life, and you don't own your life. It's not just that you're judging me. It's because you cross the boundaries of love and respect. Now you're getting somewhere. Now you can establish the right boundaries. Okay, that's the second major category. So remember, our first one was the clinical, the personal stuff, your emotions, your thoughts, and your behaviors, and then your key connections and relationships. And the third one is what we call the functional system, symptoms. And functional means the doing aspects of life, the things we're supposed to do in life and perform it. When God created the universe, as soon as he created Adam and Eve, he said, I've got a functional, he didn't say the word functional, but he said, I've got a task for you to do. You've got this world. I want you to subdue it, and I want you to rule it. He had this garden where he wanted him to take responsibility over it and do things with it. That was Adam and Eve's task and mission. So the functional arena of life is the things that we do. And it's basically things like your career, or if you're a student, your school. I love it when students are looking at this material and getting something from it, because hopefully this will help you from the time you're 19 to the time you're 99. So I really appreciate those of you who are writing in saying that you're younger and you're a student and you're kind of putting this together. That's very cool. Your tasks, how do you keep your house? How do you plan your vacation? I've got a friend who only takes one vacation a year, and we're talking about that. And he doesn't have good boundaries in his time, and I don't want him to burn out. He's a good guy. So you got to take charge of your task and your and your how the house is kept, how you keep your vacay. You got to be a little bit not selfish about those vacations, but you've got to be a good steward. So you'll have that battery charged, and as soon as you get back to work, then you can know, hey, a few months now down the line, I'm gonna have another vacation. I'm all excited, and what we're going to plan this one. See, it gives you hope. If you don't have a vacation coming down the line, you don't have hope, and hope deferred to make the heart sick, and we don't want people to get sick. So you've got your career and your school and your task, and also your money, your finances. These are all the aspects of how you kind of do life. And career problems, school problems, task problems, money problems are the same issue. The issue being, if I'm having problems in my career, I wonder if it's because I'm not setting the right boundaries that I need. Like, I've known people who are very, very talented and good in engineering, for example, but kind of felt like they're at the potential here to be a 10 in their career, and now they're 38 and they're like a 4. Why is that? I've got all this talent. There's this divide between what I'm capable of, the potential, and what I'm actually doing, my performance, the potential performance divide. Well, why is that so great? A lot of times because they didn't set boundaries. and they didn't have requirements with their companies and say, I think I'm a valuable asset, and I need more money, or I need a new position, or I need a leadership role, or I need to take over this new initiative that you guys are doing in Cleveland, or whatever. So a lot of times career frustration and happiness has to do with a lack of boundaries. Sometimes the same thing in school. Maybe if you're afflicted with being impulsive. Oh my gosh, I remember my schooling years, and I was a horrible student. I just didn't have any boundaries, and crammed at the last minute, and I regret a lot of that. As I got more into graduate school, they kind of force you to study better. But, I had really bad boundaries in my relationships and in my study habits. And so that was a sign, not that school was a problem. I wasn't stupid or more stupid than anybody else, but I just had bad boundaries. Your task. How do you handle your household? How do you handle your things like dishwashing and cleanliness, and are there a million projects around? One way I can always tell if somebody's got boundaries problems is ask them how the house looks. Because they'll say, well, I've got a million projects. I'm building a ship over here, and I'm doing pottery over here, and there's an archery range over here, and they're all kind of half finished because I never get to them. It's sort of an ADD life. Well, people who are good starters and don't do a real good job in finishing, that's often a task problem. So pay attention that that's a boundary issue where you can't stick with something because you're distracted by other people, other people wanting things from you, or they've got their own crises and this sort of thing. Money problems. Are you holding on to your money? Are you being diligent and giving away a certain percentage to God and the charities and all these sorts of things? Are you saving up for yourself? Are you saying no and like being a good steward of your money? Or do you tend to kind of give it away to the wrong people just because they're asked for it? Are you subsidizing somebody who has no interest in growing up? Have you got a 28-year-old, a functioning adult in your home that you're doing the laundry and paying for everything without them having a plan? Or are you using money because you can't say no to anybody? Or are you just kind of binging and going shopping and to make yourself feel good in an addictive manner because you don't have any choices anywhere else? See, these are all signs that there's a boundary problem underneath there. Important to realize as you look at this list, number one, I hope you don't feel depressed because it's a long list, but it's really, I think, it's God's signal to us that, hey, I want to give you a little wake-up call that I'm going to let certain things happen in your feeling state and in your thoughts and in your relationships and in how you handle life because I want you to be a righteous person. I want you to say no when you need to say no and say yes when you need to say yes. We know the Bible says that. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. So He's being nice to us. He's giving us these pains not because He's mad at us or trying to prove something to us, because He's trying to say the oil light's on here. So don't ever confuse the symptom and the fruit. And don't get depressed by this. That's a sign there's something you can do. Second thing, though, is to remember, there's always something you can do. There's always a choice you can make. And if you read the original Boundaries material, we always talk about, especially in the law of power, there's something you can do about this. You're never helpless. Third thing to remember, though, is not every one of these symptoms that I listed is a boundary problem, because some people think it's all about boundaries. Well, not all the time. You can have a fever of 102. That's a symptom. But a fever of 102 doesn't mean that necessarily if you've got a bacterial infection, you might have a virus or you might have a hormonal issue. So the symptom can have different causes. In the same way, a career problem might be a lack of boundaries, but a career problem might also be because you haven't found out your niche. Or a career problem might be because you're isolated, don't have a lot of friends, you don't have a lot of gas inside, you don't have a lot of encouragement, you're sort of a lone ranger and you're a hermit in your head. So that might be a reason. So it's not always a boundary problem, but a lot of times it is. Okay, a couple of thought questions for your continuing growth, and either in your small group that you're working with this on or yourself. First, what fruits are alerting you to your boundary issues? Just go over the fruit list, the 3 categories, and say, I always believe in what I call the neurological highlighter. Like, does one of those kind of jump out at me like, oh goodness, that's important to look at. So what fruits are you looking at? Secondly, which of the types of symptoms, of the 3 types of symptoms, is the most important for you and why? Generally speaking, we can go, yeah, business is okay, work's okay, I feel okay, I don't have any bad habits, but gosh, I got a relationship that I'm really struggling in. So the big picture of the 3 symptoms, and why is that? And then, who do you need to say no to this week to help your symptoms begin to resolve? I'll bet you there's a relationship, somebody you care about a lot or that's important to you, that you've just been kind of kicking the can down the road because it's uncomfortable and scary, you're not sure it's going to go well, maybe there's somebody you need to have the talk with this week. If you have to have that talk, read Henry my book, How to Have That Difficult Conversation You've Been Avoiding. It'll take you through that. So, problems and symptoms and trees and fruits, that's God's way of helping us to grow spiritually and emotionally and in our relationships. So I hope it's been a good session for you. Hope you have something to work on, and we'll see you next time.
For more Solutions recordings or other personal and spiritual growth products by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend, visit our website at cloudtownsend.com or call 800-676-HOPE.